Good morning and welcome to another episode of the Sturgeon Bay Community Church podcast. My name is Shane Saxon and this is Joe Pachleski, and we are the pastors at Sturgeon Bay Community Church. And on today's episode, we're discussing your sermon from Sunday, which was the conclusion to a two-part series. Which, is it a series if there are just two parts?
I think it's part one and part two.
Okay. Where we discussed the value of intergenerational worship, which is something that intergenerational ministry is something that we highly, highly value at Sturgeon Bay Community Church. And what we mean by that is the emphasis is on the inter part of intergenerational. We want our young to be with our old, and we want our old to be with our young, and we want to create intentional spaces of connection between young and old so that we can benefit from the diversity of experiences and ages and stages in our church family. And so last week, we talked about honoring the elderly. This week, you talked about the young.
Right.
If you were to put this sermon into one sentence, what was the big idea that you were trying to bring across?
Yeah, that, first that the Bible and God himself honors young people. He esteems the young. You don't have to, I'm not answering the question. I was about to go into explanation. That God esteems the young and that the young can be a blessing to the church family.
Yeah. Now, in our day and age, in this culture, you had the great illustration of how much emphasis is put on the young in Argentina. In my experience, it seems like there is, in our country, a little bit of a young, things are skewed towards the youthfulness. What you're talking about isn't necessarily celebrating immaturity. It's valuing potential. It's valuing the vulnerability of children. Suss out why you think we ought to put an appropriate level of appreciation on the young in our church family.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just that the young bring kind of vitality and youth and exuberance and, energy. All that is true. But the young actually have something to offer. And I think that is, as we talk about our values of our church and reminding ourselves that we are children of God, what does that mean? I think that means that we have an affection for God, that we have a big imagination for God and what he's doing. And those are real value adds as a child that we sometimes lose as adults. Yeah. And so I think being able to recapture and glean from even kids and how they think about things and what questions they're asking, I think is a value to a church.
Yeah, absolutely. So the text that you decided to be the kind of springboard for exploring this value is one of the more important texts in the Old Testament, and that is Deuteronomy chapter 6. And that's where in verse 4 we get this thing called the Shema. And it says, "Listen, Israel, as for the Lord your God, the Lord is one." How does that serve as an inspiration for the entire sermon that you preached on Sunday?
Yeah, I think in some ways, we could have preached that one verse and it would have been enough, I think, because the singular idea that all kids and even adults, right? Let's be fair. We all want to answer the question, what's the meaning of life? Yeah. What's the main purpose?
Yep.
And we try to answer that in culture in a multitude of ways. And yet the biblical answer is God himself. So the Lord our God, the Lord is one, is kind of I would say, right, and you check me if I'm wrong, the seminal Old Testament statement that distills all of this down to what is the most important thing we could teach. What is the most important way we could honor our children? By instilling that sentiment into their hearts, right?
It's been pointed out many times, but in the heart of every single person is this need and desire to worship. We were made to worship. And even people who don't consider themselves worshipers, they're worshiping. Their identity, their love, their affection, their schedules, their habits, everything about them is oriented around those things that they hold nearest and dearest to themselves. And most of the things, might I say all of the things that we worship that aren't God, don't satisfy us like God.
And fall infinitely short of his glory.
And the Israelites, they were the one people that said, the one God who is for us, it's Yahweh. And no one else and nothing else can satisfy. And so what should you do? Love him with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind.
That's right. That's exactly right.
I loved how you connected that to children, but bring out that connection because this is a message for everyone, but you really saw how this is something that is fundamentally important for kids specifically?
Yeah, I mean, because underlying this great teaching is this idea that you should teach them to you. Moses says, I want to teach this to you, Israel, but then to your sons and to your sons' sons. There's obviously in his mind, there's a longevity, there's a longitudinal aspect to what he's trying to get at. And then kind of to work it backwards, that this is something that the God of your fathers, meaning God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So it's almost as if he's reaching backwards through generations and forwards into the next generations and saying, this is for all of us, but particularly, and he doesn't say this, but I think the implication is you're only as good as your next generation as a church or as a people of God. And how many times have we seen in the Old Testament over and over again, a pure, a holy king or a pure and a holy generation, but then the next one that rises up after abandons the faith, for example.
Yeah.
So there's a constant need for children to know this and to imbibe deeply of the Lord.
I love that you brought this out, and I don't know if you're doing this consciously, but that idea to me is the main idea of the book of Deuteronomy, and that is the people of Israel. Remember, Moses is speaking to the wilderness generation. Their parents have died, and so he's talking to their kids, and he's saying, remember what I did for your parents, and then they failed. But I'm going to do this for you. But you know what? You're going to go into the land, and you're going to fail. But remember what I did. And then, he says that to them throughout. And then in Deuteronomy 32, there's this great poem where he says, you know what? You're going to go into the land, and you're going to fail. But I'm going to pursue you anyway. And I'm going to pursue your kids. And it's like the whole book is saying, no matter who you are the wilderness generation. I've acted in the past for your parents. They failed. I'm going to act for you. You'll fail. But then I'm going to pursue you.
Yeah.
And so are you going to trust him?
Right. There's always this hope, right? Maybe the next generation will get it, will do it better than we do.
Yeah.
We have some sense of this as parents in a very economic way. That, I want my kids to live better than me.
Yeah.
But from a spiritual standpoint, I think that's exactly what's happening in this book. God is saying, I want your kids to be better than you, even.
Yeah. So then practically, what does that look like in this passage? But then you brought out some more practical applications.
Yeah, I mean, how do we not just pay lip service to this idea of, we're intergenerational. We like all the generations. I think that is borne out practically in terms of the sacrifice of your time. You have to consciously go beyond your immediate family to your church family and say, you know what? I don't know this family very well. I'm going to sacrifice some of my schedule and some of my money and some of my time and whatever, resources and energies to go befriend another family in the church, to really get to know kids. And I really tried to make a point of this is listen to kids. Don't come in with the assumption that they don't have anything to say. They have real questions. They have real fears. They have real anxieties. And if we would take the time to esteem them, as Jesus does, let them come to me so I can heal them, so I can spend time with them. He says this in Matthew 18 and kind of in 19 as well. We need to do it likewise.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think it does really flow from the text itself, right? What do you make of these ideas of, teach them to your sons? And, you brought out that word to teach them diligently has a kind of interesting nuance if you really look at it. What did you make of the nuances in the ways that they're told to instruct the kids? Yeah,
in my mind, there's these 4 verbs: teach, talk about, bind them, and write them. And I think the thrust behind all of them is extreme. Engrave them upon their hearts, repeatedly drill down into their souls these kind of truths. Talk about them when you're active and when you're sitting there and not doing anything, when you're sleeping and when you're awake. It's kind of an inundation of in every way, shape, or form you can do. Be a Christian, of course, or be a Jew in this sense, right? But be for God, be a God-fearer for these children.
Yeah.
So I think it speaks to not only, certainly teaching in this kind of formal transference of information, but also the unwritten curriculum of your life.
Yeah. And you're walking and you're lying down and you're going.
Yeah.
Teach.
Do you believe?
Yeah.
And are you worshiping?
Yeah. It reminds me of this author, Justin Whitmell Early, wrote a book, Habits of the Household.
Great
that I
book.
give to every person
That's right.
who dedicates a child.
You gave it to me.
And I give it to you. And I'll give it to anyone. Just come to me. I'll give you a copy.
Right.
And one of the points he makes is that the culture of your home is what's normal.
Yes.
And what the Israelites are being told to do is make it normal that everything about you is defined by your relationship to Torah. On your doorpost,
Yep.
on your forehead, make it clear that you are in loving relationship with your one God. For our families at our church or Christian families, maybe speak to parents specifically. What does it mean to have this kind of intentionality in our homes to make what's normal, our culture, one that is God-honoring and having that kind of intention with our kids?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a great question because I feel like we're fighting 30-year-old headwinds about this, about the church buying into this idea that we need to be relevant with the culture. Like, you need to look more like the culture so that they will understand where you're coming from.
Yeah.
And this speaks really very contra to that. So it's almost the idea of, would you guys be willing to be odd again, to look odd to the culture, to over-spiritualize in a sense? Of course, it's not, but you'll feel like you're over-spiritualizing everything, from the music you listen to the books that you read, to the conversations that you have, to the ways that you spend your time and energies. Are you willing to take the zag when the culture is zigging, to say that God has something to say on all of these aspects of life? And we are going to be different to the point where it will look odd.
Yeah.
So I think that's what I would say to parents.
Yeah, and I also think it kind of challenges this notion that it would be like legalistic to be really rigorous and intentional about, family devotions every night.
Right.
Well, not everyone's going to achieve it, and you're not going to earn your way to heaven by doing it, but it would be really great if you do family devotions with your kids every night, and you really should make that as a goal to have family worship. And things like that. The Israelites were told, hey, you want to love the Lord your God with all of your soul, strength, and might? Well, then arrange your life such that with your children, you're sharing Torah with them at every opportunity.
Yeah, and it was my understanding that they recited these words to themselves at least twice a day. And, we would obviously disagree with like the Muslim practice of prayer 3 times a day, but isn't there something compelling to the idea that stop what you're doing, morning, noon, and night, acknowledge the God whom you serve, roll out a prayer carpet and bow your head to the one whom you love and serve? Like, there is something compelling about those rhythms and those normalities, I guess, of doing something like this.
So outside of the nuclear family, for a person who maybe their kids are estranged, maybe they're not near kids, how would the people of our church really actually live this out when they maybe don't have kids or teenagers in their regular life?
Yeah, I think this is a pretty big challenge because, again, culturally we're pretty self-sufficient. We don't like to impose upon other people's families. The family unit is still somewhat sacrosanct. So the idea that, like, no, we're a church family, therefore we can impose upon one another. We should impose upon one another. Re-embracing, I don't know where it came from, but the idea of it takes a village to raise a child. Those barriers aren't as prevalent in other cultures. And I talked about this in Argentina. You would take your kids to a park, and you didn't worry about where your kids were because you knew every adult was watching all of the kids. And so I think there's a mentality there that I think we need to begin to adopt in the church, that, like, we're all responsible. Yes, the parents obviously are. Bible speaks to that clearly, but also any adult in the church has a responsibility. Not just a privilege or an optional kind of mindset, but it's my responsibility too. To raise these kids. To verify what the mom and dad is saying, to come in and be a part of those devotionals. Share meals with them. Anyway.
I think that maybe low-hanging fruit is that older people who don't have kids have resources to expend on kids that families oftentimes don't. Take those opportunities, sponsor the trip, pay for the opportunity, and then just say, hey, a requirement of me giving you this money is that you would share with me about what it results in or what it provides. Using those things that God gives to the older generation to provide, but then also I think leaning in when it feels like a kid is maybe not reciprocating. Children are complicated, teenagers even more so. And a lot of times they don't gush about how joyful they are to have older people in their lives, but it doesn't mean that it's not impactful or meaningful. And so I think sometimes older people need to just press in and kind of move past some of the awkwardness.
And I agree with you. And I think on top of the financial resources, there's just great time resources to use. And I think, look, the older generation did not grow up with this mindset, necessarily either. So it will be just as much up to them to press into this kind of idea, because certainly the kids aren't going to initiate those sorts of relationships. So it will be up to them to kind of press into maybe a more unnatural feeling, to just like work past that, because my guess is that it'll be a huge blessing to both of them.
I think too at this church, we've been blessed just to have other parents of similar ages or sometimes of other ages. And one of the things that we've benefited from is trying to lean into talking and sharing openly about the struggles of parenting and how we're thinking about parenting. Because I think one of the things that mitigates against practicing this and living it out in community is that it is scary to be vulnerable about how hard it is to raise children for the Lord.
Yeah, right.
But I think if we cultivate a culture where we can openly share about what we're trying to do and without the fear of embarrassment or failure or shame, then we actually start to come together in a way that's very profound.
Yes.
Where we're inviting people into our children's lives.
Right.
You guys are on the other end of this journey from me and my wife. Have you seen that dynamic play out?
Yeah, for sure. We've had a number of people, and I'm talking from like 40, 35 and up, who have done this very thing. They've asked, can we be a part of your son's life, of your daughter's life? Can we mentor them? Can we spend time with them? Can we just cultivate our own love of certain hobbies with them? And in my mind, I'm like, this is the greatest thing ever. Because why? Mom and dad don't know everything. We need to have a multitude of a cloud of witnesses around saying, yeah, we're all saying the same thing. We all believe the same thing. We all worship the same God. And I think it's just a huge blessing for my kids, particularly to have had those experiences. I don't think you can't put a price on that. They're solidifying our kids' faith in ways that we would never be able to do alone. So,
what do you think ultimately, kind of as we wrap up here, it looks like for a kid or for a teenager to become an authentic worshiper? What are some of those concrete things that older parents or grandparents should be leaning on their kids specifically to learn and to embody to really move in the direction that you're describing?
Yeah, this is a good question. I don't think it's an easy answer. But I think you put your finger on it earlier in the idea of like creating a normality for kids. What's normal? So normal rhythms of Sunday worship, normal rhythms of being able to sing out loud, pray out loud, open your Bible in places that aren't, where other people are, to destigmatize the Christianity around them. Because certainly, our kids are now growing up in an age where it's becoming more and more odd for people to practice their faith in a way that's not, fringy or something like that. So I think just making it normal, because I do think kids pick up on any given Sunday. They're looking at the people around them, asking the question in their hearts, like, is this true? Yeah. Do they really mean what they're saying? And so I think we can just be authentic worshipers ourselves, and that's kind of feeding them the unwritten curriculum underneath what we're doing, what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's a great word. Ultimately, what we desire for the kids and the teenagers of our church is that for them, Yahweh would be the only one for them.
The only one.
And that they would respond with a heart of love that really compels them to put their whole heart, mind, strength, everything towards loving Him and pursuing Him with their lives.
Yeah, amen. Couldn't have said it better.